is, I think, well known to many people in the room, Dr. Elena Bergia. Elena is a graduate of Queen's. She did her PhD in anthropology and Irish studies here after completing an MSc in Social and Cultural Anthropology at the Vrije Universiteit, Amsterdam. Elena is now an independent researcher with an extensive publication record on topics which include gender and conflict, gendered heroism, and an increasing focus on migration studies. She's currently with us as a teaching assistant in the School of HAPP and also as an open learning instructor. So Elena's going to talk to us today about a subject that she's currently researching and writing, which is Into Stirrups, Identities in Motion between Northern Ireland and Casalattico in Italy. Elena, it's great to have you here. Over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for being here. So the topic of today's presentation is, generally speaking, the Italian migration to Northern Ireland, with a particular focus on Casalattico, which some of you are familiar with, a small village in central Italy from which most of the historical Italian families in Northern Ireland originate. So the wrong for exchange.
You just make the
Yeah, that's just me. Don't worry about it. It happens. Yeah. Okay. So the history of the Italian migration to Northern Ireland, like that of many other migrant communities here and elsewhere, is one of great adaptation, resilience, ingenuity, and entrepreneurship as well. Despite some bumps and instances of xenophobia along the way that Jack Krangle illustrates, for example, in his book, Migrants, Immigration and Diversity in 20th Century Northern Ireland, it's also a story or a history of successful integration. So when we look at second, third, fourth generation, quote unquote, Italians in Northern Ireland, and I say quote unquote because obviously when we're talking about second, third, fourth generation, the label Italian may be objectionable, but they are integrated in the social fabric of the province, and most visibly, as everybody knows, as entrepreneurs in the food industry. So what we know about the history of this community, and I'm also using the word community between brackets because we all know the implications of the term, but it's due to some research, like Jack's books, for example, and some anecdotal evidence that has been passed down through the generations as kind of lore. The traces of the Italian presence in Northern Ireland, however, are visible, particularly in two main areas. One of them is the built environment and influence on the local cuisine. So, the built environment, what we know about migration from Casalattico is that apparently the first migration from the area occurred in the late 19th century when craftsmen were brought in by institutional patrons, including parish building committees, as well as by private contractors to work or contribute to the ongoing Catholic Church building boom in the province, which wasn't a province at the time. And naturally, it would be incorrect to talk about Italian migration before that era because Italy became a united country only between 1861 and 1870. This first arrival left, again, a tangible mark on Catholic churches and monasteries. So the Clonard Monastery in West Belfast, the Holy Cross Church in Ardoyne, on civic buildings, most notably the City Hall, the Belfast City Hall, and on places of leisure like the Crown Bar. And also on a tradition that has almost now become local, which is that of terrazzo floors, as they're called. There are interesting stories out there about Italian and Italian origin craftsmen who, even in more recent years, who made sure to sort of keep the secrets of the trade and the craft within the community by using Italian words and slang during work. I've heard that from people who have worked in that sector and are maybe second or third generation. And although these people would not speak Italian, they do know some Italian words that were used in the workplace. The food industry is obviously one of the main things that Italy is known for. So apparently the first skilled workers who landed here to work on this building in the construction and decoration sector then triggered a chain migration, and the later waves pursued better livelihoods by creating family-run enterprises in the food industries, particularly, as probably most of you know, with fish and chip shops or parlors, as they were called, and ice cream. One of the interesting and somewhat endearing aspects of this kind of ethnic entrepreneurship is that for most of the migrants who engage in this type of, in the food industry, were not people who would have done that back home. So this kind of became an ethnic activity. Back home, most of them would have been farmers who struggled to make a living on marginal farmland. And upon arrival here, after following relatives who were involved with the construction work, apparently they found a niche in the market, which was street food, or the absence of what we will now call street food, and some local produce, fish and potatoes, and decided, let's do something with that. So as an Italian, I always find it amusing that fish and chips is an Italian invention, given that we do eat fried fish and chips, but they taste very different. They look very different. So I find that fun and endearing somehow. As most of you probably know, some Italian families ended up creating very successful businesses that are thriving and actually expanding to this day. Obviously, the most notable example being that of the Morellis with their ice cream empire, which now extends well over the UK and Ireland. The Caffolas, who have now gone into the coffee market as well, etc. These being the most probably famous examples. So again, the most tangible sign of Italian presence in Northern Ireland has to do with food and buildings/art, which is hardly surprising given that these are the two reasons why I think Italy is still on the world map of relevant countries, as opposed to having been forgotten in the midst of history. This is what we do, art and food. That's pretty much it. So Casalattico, what is not visible in the landscape of Northern Ireland, of course, is the fact that most of the historical Italian families in Northern Ireland originate from this one tiny corner of the world, which is the town, or should I say the village of Casalattico in central Italy. The current official resident population is 500 people, so it's a very small place. This is where the Morellis, the Caffolas, the Fuscos, the Notarantonios, the Maccaris, the Liegios come from. By the way, I'm not saying that all the historical Italian families come from Casalattico, because there's a contingent of people from Lucca in Tuscany. I haven't been able to contact them. But a large number of historical Italian families do originate from this place. So the origins, or the beginnings, if you will, of this localized immigration are known only in part, thanks to the research that exists. As I mentioned, we do know that some skilled workers were brought in to work in construction in the late 19th century. However, given the situation of the town at that time, it seems unlikely that there would be large numbers of skilled workers in an area that was mostly rural and certainly quite impoverished. We also know that for some people, Northern Ireland was a random destination. Some people started off in France, some people went to Scotland, Ireland in the Republic, and then eventually in what is now Northern Ireland. And Jack Rangel calls this haphazard migration, which means that people didn't necessarily know where they would end up. Unfortunately, we do not know who the first person was to leave Casalattico, which I would very much like to find out, but I haven't got there yet. So this is one of the puzzles that I would like to solve, and this through this research project that I've worked on for quite a while at this point. And it's a historical anthropological project on the Italian migration to Northern Ireland So not just from Casalattico, but including the contemporary Italian migration from different parts of the country to Northern Ireland, to explore ideally both historical migratory experiences through family histories, as well as the contemporary migratory influx from Italy. The overall theoretical goal, if you will, is to investigate the construction of collective identities among a migrant community in a society that is still largely divided along ethnopolitical lines. So how does that impact on migrant communities, and possibly vice versa? How does the presence of migrant communities, how may the presence of migrant communities impact the division? The historical part of the project is going more slowly, primarily because I'm not a historian, so apologies in advance. I am an anthropologist. Luckily, I've managed to secure the collaboration of two historians from the universities of Bologna, my hometown, and Cagliari, so hopefully that will speed things up. The anthropological side of the research, which is more like my thing, is more advanced. I've conducted ethnographic research both here and in Casalattico. In Northern Ireland, I've interviewed approximately 20 participants, including first, second, third, and fourth generation Italians, quote unquote. And of course, I've gathered, as you do, informal observations from participating in the events and the activities of the community. I also conducted fieldwork in Casalattico for a brief period, unfortunately, a brief but intense stay in the summer of 2023, interviewing formally 9 participants and meeting other people of interest. The 9 participants include people that I would call returning migrants, so people who have returned to Casalattico in their retirement age, contemporary migrants, people currently living in Ireland, north and south, and considering settling there for good, and also people that I would call, and I call in this presentation, perpetual travelers, so people who haven't really settled here or there, but seem to be constantly on the move, and quite happily so, between Casalattico and Northern Ireland. Ireland as well, however, my research only focuses on the north. So the arrow there points to the fact that that street is called Cafolla, so it has the name of one of the historical Italian families in Northern Ireland. So in this paper, I've tried to give a sort of a visual embodiment to this kind of perpetual mobility and the processual identities that this generates, using the Italian expression, keeping one's feet into different stirrups, which is in the title of the paper. So the expression is a bit strange and needs some clarification. So unlike what you might think, this does not describe the normal condition of a, say, horse rider who will have one foot in one stirrup and the other in the other stirrup for grasp and sort of balance. The expression in Italian refers to someone who is either involved in different sets of circumstances or interested or tempted by 2 different sets of circumstances and tries to strike a balance between them. The expression generally has a negative connotation, and it's used to refer to someone who has a partner, spouse, or stable partner, and also a lover on the side. So they're trying to keep their feet in 2 stirrups. So the negative connotation is not the connotation that I'm using here now. I'm using it, on the contrary, in a very positive way, indicating the fact that these perpetual travelers seem to be able to effectively keep and manage their 2 or 3 lives at once without having to choose one, which is not that common for migrants. So for context, I will give you a brief overview of the contemporary Italian migration to Northern Ireland based on a few official data that we have. So this information was given to me by the Consulate General of Italy in Edinburgh. So there currently are 2,100 Italians registered as residing in Northern Ireland with the Registry of Italians residing abroad. It's a very small number. In theory, Italian citizens are required to register if they spend longer than 3 months in a foreign country or abroad and plan to stay for about a year. However, not everybody does. I may have been guilty by omission myself. because doing that means losing some benefits of, for example, the Italian healthcare. So in that sense, there may be people who are keeping their feet into stirrups in this case as well, and trying to. So the number is an underestimation. There certainly are more. And of course, the number does not include people of remote Italian origin who now live in Northern Ireland. In terms of socioeconomic characteristics, the small communities is really as varied as they come. Their educational backgrounds go from no official qualification to PhD. Some of them are working at Queen's University. Their occupational titles include, among others, student, lecturer, manual laborer, hospitality worker. Approximately half of them live in Belfast, with the remaining half residing all over the province. And as my ethnographic research in Belfast indicates, their political views, including their views on the situation in Northern Ireland, the national question in Northern Ireland, are again as varied as they come. Academically speaking, not much is known about this community, the reason being that, luckily for us, we are usually not the object or the target of xenophobia or racism, so this keeps us out of the news, and partly out of academic research as well. Not seen as a problematic community, neither in terms of being the object of racism, nor in terms of, quote unquote, creating problems, if you'll pass that expression. Small as this collectivity is, it is quite active, also thanks to the tireless efforts of the Italian honorary consulate in Northern Ireland. Just recently, we had an Italian karaoke event, which was fun and also strange, I have to say, a bit strange, in 2 Royal Avenue, of all places. I think we're also becoming more visible in the kind of social cultural landscape because there are many new business ventures, as usual, again, in the food industry, mostly. So I'll move now to my brief field research in Casalattico. I spent 5 intense days there in the summer of 2023. Intense because the heat in the Italian summer is really kind of unbearable. However, the welcome that I received was absolutely unbeatable. I was driven around, treated to lunches, dinners, whatever, to field trips, taken to local archives, and overall really treated with the kindness that you would normally reserve to old friends or family members. Eventually, as I said, I conducted interviews with 9 residents, their ages ranging from early 20s to 80s, and did some archival research. However, that is very much in its initial stages. All the people I interviewed had experienced migration to Ireland, north or south, either personally or directly, or in their close family. So the planning for my field trip had begun, as they often do, with me reaching out to local authorities, asking for logistical assistance and maybe broader support for my project. Sadly, but not unusually, the hot potato, being me, was eventually passed down to someone else. But that was a good thing ultimately, because I met a local woman who's very much involved with communal life in the village, very passionate about history, and she turned out to be a great guide and gatekeeper. So Casalattico, as we were saying, is a very small town or a village in central Italy. In administrative terms, it's in the Lazio region, so the region where Rome is located. Geographically, it's between Rome and Naples, which is in the Campania region. As you probably know, in Italy, there's a certain tension between North and South. Not that you would know anything about tension in Northern Ireland, but we do have that. When I say tension, I'm referring to historical and contemporary grievances, cultural differences, real or perceived as they may be, contrasting narratives about the history of the country, and sometimes downright racism from the north aimed at the south. I'm saying this because while geographically Casalattico is in central Italy, people will probably position it differently depending on where they are in Italy. So people from the south would probably see it as central Italy. People from the north would probably class it as southern Italy. The dialect spoken in Casalattico is officially Southern Laziale dialect. So from the Lazio region, the southern part of the Lazio region. However, I'm not a linguist or anything like that, but I do find it very difficult to understand. And to me, it sounds closer to the dialect they speak in Naples than the dialect they speak in Rome. But again, that's not my area of expertise. So as I mentioned, the official resident population is 500. However, the locals told me that the number of actual year-round residents is significantly lower. Because again, some of the official residents, while owning homes and some of them actually villas in the surrounding area, only actually return to Casalattico once a year, particularly to participate in this event, which is the Irish Fest. So the Irish Fest takes place in this tiny village in central Italy in August. I haven't been able to see that, but I'm dying to see that, obviously. This gives you an idea of the quite unique nature of this place and of the strong links that it maintains with Ireland, both north and south. So during the Irish Fest, they play Irish music, they eat Irish food, actually sort of importing frozen chips and beer from Ireland, which I don't know why that happens, from the Republic of Ireland. And so, for example, conducting field work during that time would be very difficult because there is no hotel or anything like that in Casalattico. And since everybody comes back during that time of the year, it would be impossible to find a place to stay in town, because all the houses that are maybe empty during the rest of the year would have the official residents or their relatives coming back for this event. I was told privately that the fact that some very successful migrants have built this kind of mansions in the outskirts of the town is the object of some resentment. Not everybody's very happy about that. Some people think that it's showing off. And this again gives us an indication really of the intricacy of experiences in such a small place, such a microcosm. Similarly varied are the political views held by the locals, with some intracommunal animosity and one local resident calling everybody else a fascist. And I will not go there. So these are some pictures, obviously, from Casalattico. This is August 2023. So as you can see, it's quite empty. This is before the Irish Fest of that year. Unlike every Italian town or village that I've ever visited, Casalattico doesn't have a cafe or cafeteria or a bar, as we would call it. We use the word bar to indicate a place where you mostly have coffee and a quick lunch and breakfast rather than drink alcohol. So that's what we mean by a bar. They don't have one, which is very unusual. The central town square hosts a pizzeria, which is only open in the evening during the summer, I was told. And I think that the fact that there is no bar or cafe is further proof, although not a scientific one, that the actual residents could not possibly amount to 500 people, because where would they have coffee if there was so many people living there? And where would they exchange information and news and gossip, which is what you do when you go for coffee? So when I visited Casalattico in 2023, this function seemed to be performed by the main square, which you can see there, where some of the residents would gather in the quite unbearable summer heat to have a chat, discuss events, etc. At the time of my visit, I was told that there was only one child living in the village. Most residents were pensioners, many of whom, as I mentioned, have returned to Casalattico after long migratory experiences in Ireland and elsewhere to enjoy their retirement. However, this pattern of migration, settlement in the host country, and then final return to the hometown does not encompass the entire migratory experience of the people from Casalattico or Casalatticesi. The migratory journeys undertaken by the people from Casalattico are often very complex and cross different countries. So as I was mentioning, some people have lived in France, in Ireland, in the south, north of Ireland, other parts of Europe. What I find most interesting and also fascinating is that there seems to be no end to this coming and going. So rather than, as I said, settling in the host country or returning to the homeland for good, there are people who seem to be constantly on the move. Never settled, or perhaps settled in 2 or 3 different places at once, which is what I call having keeping their feet in 2 different stirrups in a positive way, like being able to handle 2 different lives, basically. So one example will clarify this. So one of the families I met is composed of 3 generations: grandparents, grandparents in their 80s, parents in their 60s, and a daughter in her 30s, and a married daughter, whom I will call Maria. So Maria, her parents have a long history of perpetual mobility between Casalattico and Northern Ireland, while Maria herself has never left Casalattico. For most of her childhood, when her parents were working in Northern Ireland, she was raised by her grandparents. She would like to migrate to Canada one day, where she also has relatives, but until now, she's always lived there. So the entire family lives in one building, the house that was built by the family over time. However, the depiction is not really correct, because while the 2 furthest apart generations, meaning grandparents and granddaughter, do live permanently in this home, the middle generation, Maria's parents, live between Casalattico and Northern Ireland. So I'm not sure how exactly this works in terms of practicalities, but what I did gather is that after years of hard work in Northern Ireland, this couple managed to buy a home there, or here, sorry, a couple of fish and chip shops. So financially they are settled and they can now enjoy some well-deserved rest in their hometown. However, whenever there's a need for them to lend a hand in the family business, they will just go back for however long is necessary to Northern Ireland. And conversely, they may have people from Casalattico joining them in Northern Ireland whenever the business requires more hands. So their story really isn't one of migration, it's one of perpetual mobility. They seem to be enjoying both their homes or homelands at this point equally, and to be able to make the best of both, depending on the circumstances and the challenges they encounter. So in the language arena, Casalattico is effectively a bubble, which again gives an indication of the variety of migratory experiences of its inhabitants. The interview recordings I have do offer a good sample of such multiplicity, and also of the constant switching in between languages. So English naturally functions as a lingua franca, spoken or understood by pretty much everybody in the village, although not completely everybody. What's interesting, and again, kind of funny, is the fact that the English spoken in this tiny isolated village in central Italy is spoken with very different accents depending on where these people lived most of their lives. So some have a very kind of soft Dublin accent, you will hear a strong, thick Belfast accent, all within one conversation, to the point that when people communicate with each other, it's almost like they're communicating from different cultures, which is to an extent, I think, true. The other lingua franca in the village is, of course, Italian. However, not everybody can speak it. So, for example, one of the residents I interviewed lived in Northern Ireland for the first half of his life. He's now retired in Casalattico for decades, but hasn't learned Italian. So he speaks English with whatever local accent he has, which again means that he can live quite easily in Casalattico without speaking Italian, because everybody will be able to understand what he's saying in English. I was also told by my local guide and friend that Italian was really only used during the interviews and chats because I was there, because generally speaking, the residents use the local dialect, except for those who only speak English. So having your local dialect as the first language is not entirely uncommon in Italy. It's common particularly in southern regions, but interestingly also in some parts of the northeast, like in Veneto. However, it becomes interesting and a bit confusing when, again, in the one conversation, you have the dialect, the Italian, and English. As someone from Bologna in northern Italy, I do find, as I mentioned, this dialect very difficult to understand. And in fact, there was an interesting moment during my stay there where I was being driven around, as usual, by very nice local guides. And we were stopped by a local lady who started having a conversation with my guides or friends in the local dialect. And I gathered that she was talking about her hands. I didn't get that much. And about the heat. And what I thought she said was that because of the heat, her hands were not stinking anymore, which I find very confusing. I thought, well, surely the heat would increase the stench. And also, why would that be a concern of hers? Because she was clearly concerned. It then turns out, so after she left, I asked my friends to explain the strange hand heat situation. And there was a long moment of hilarity because they explained to me that what she did say was that because of the heat, the hens were not laying eggs anymore. So this means that the Casalatticese expression or verb for laying eggs sounds exactly like the Italian verb for smelling bad. So that's just a very confusing babel of languages in the one place. Besides English, Italian, and the local dialect, other languages are spoken by people who lived elsewhere, for example, in France. This again gives you an indication of the multiplicity and fluidity, really, of the residents' identities and experiences. So code switching among languages is a part of daily life in Casalattico, and also anywhere where the people from Casalattico find themselves. So, for example, about a year after my stay in Casalattico, I got a call from Maria, whom I was telling you about before, telling me that her mom had been unwell for some time and had decided to take her to Bologna, where there's a well-renowned private hospital, to hopefully get the healthcare she needed. So she was checked into a private hospital in Bologna, and Maria asked if I could advise her father about, what to do in Bologna, where to eat, how to find accommodation. And I, of course, offered to take care of him, take him out for lunch and things like that. So eventually it all turned out well. Maria's mom was back on her feet quite early on, and her dad, who's a native Italian speaker or Casalatticese speaker, I'm not sure which, had no problem navigating the local bureaucracy in a city like Bologna, which is fairly big, and that he didn't really know. Clearly, his experience as a perpetual traveler has provided him with the tools he needs to adapt to new circumstances. And having lived in 4 different countries myself, I can say that flexibility and adaptation does come easier with time, especially because all of us migrants do rely on whatever connection we may have with people from our own country or with other migrants. So Maria's dad had lunch with myself and my mom once in Bologna. We had a lovely time. However, the conversation, my mother was excluded from part of the conversation because Maria's dad and I found it easier, in fact, inevitable to switch to English when we were talking about Northern Irish stuff. So talking about their business in Northern Ireland or things like that, it would have been very strange and unnatural to translate that into Italian, which is both our native language, by the way. So again, this gives you an idea of the fluidity of these migrants' identities. And this choice or the idea to keep moving between Casalattico and Northern Ireland or Ireland also emerged from another conversation I had in Casalattico with his young man in his early 20s who was doing an MA in Dublin. So when I asked him what he planned to do work-wise after completing his degree, he said he would look for employment in the Republic, to which I asked, had he considered maybe looking for work elsewhere in Italy? Obviously, there is no work in Casalattico, but he may be able to find employment in other parts of Italy. And interestingly, he said, no, he hadn't even thought about it, because in this case, the Republic of Ireland was for him the only sensible choice, the obvious choice, because he had relatives there who were giving him a place to stay at the time. He had connections. He spoke the language, given that his parents, while being native Italian speakers, did live in Northern Ireland, so did teach him in Ireland, so did teach him English. And while he looked for qualified work, he could always lend a hand in the family business, again, a fish and chip shop. So this is a young man born and raised in Italy, who does not take into consideration moving elsewhere in Italy to look for work, because Ireland is really easier to navigate for him than any place in Northern Italy, for example. Easier to navigate and really the only possible choice. So for him, as for other people from Casalattico, moving between this small town in Italy to Ireland, north or south, is a more obvious and comfortable choice than exploring other parts of Italy. And he himself told me that his life really had to do with two places, Casalattico and Ireland. So Italy as a nation didn't really come into play much. So I've met some people of Casalatticese origin in Northern Ireland, second, third, fourth generation migrants. And again, I'm using the word migrant in a very loose sense here, because third generation doesn't really qualify as migrant. But some interviewees told me that they feel a strong connection with Italy in general, and particularly with Casalattico. This connection is kept alive through food, through family stories, and sometimes emerges from unexpected personality traits. So one interviewee, for example, told me that herself and her siblings use their hands a lot when they speak, and she feels that this is an Italian trait. I naturally asked, do you think this may have to do with the fact that your father was first generation Italian, and maybe that's a learned behavior? But she said that no, because in fact her father didn't do that. So didn't use his hands, apparently, despite being Italian. So her perception was that this use of our hands was very much in the blood, which raises the question, what is ethnicity in the eyes of ethnic group members? Besides having remote family in Casalattico, many Northern Irish people of Casalatticese origin also make it a point to visit Casalattico at least once in their lives, to retrace their roots, find out where their family home was, and things like that. Others make more than one trip. Some do archival research. There are families who have done quite extensive archival research. And in fact, the lady who manages the parochial archives in Casalattico told me that she receives visitors on a weekly basis from all over the world, because people from Casalattico have not only moved to Ireland, but to Canada, the US, etc. So during my brief stay in Casalattico, one archival document that I found, and let me just clarify that I haven't looked into it yet, although 2 years have elapsed. But anyway, is a document, a notebook, really, that I found in the parochial archive, which should provide a lot of interesting information when triangulated with other data from the Northern Ireland census and other sources. And the document is titled, as you can see, Registry of Children Baptized Abroad. So the colleagues that are giving me a hand with this have told me that they're not aware of similar documents anywhere else in Italy. This is not my field, so don't quote me on that. But basically what the registry does is keep trace of the dates and places of birth and of christening of children born abroad of Casalatticese parents. So the document suggests that these migrant parents wanted to be sure that their home parish, and probably the family members who had remained in Casalattico, knew that their children had been christened and were brought up Catholics. We don't know why the oldest entry dates to 1880, so we don't know why it started in 1880. I don't know that. Certainly, as I mentioned, in a few years previous to that, Italy was not Italy officially, so the status of the church, parish church, would have been different. But the first name, the child's name is Pietro Villa, or Petrus Villa, because it's in Latin. This part of the registry is in Latin. Born in Liverpool in 1880, baptized the following year in St. Joseph's Church. The first Fusco that I've been able to find is an Anthony Fusco, born in France in 1887 and baptized the same year. And the most recent entry dates to 1938, so the registry covers 58 years. When we look at the surnames, we see a recurrence of the surnames that I've already mentioned, intertwined in all the possible combinations, which is logical given that all these people came from this tiny village. The fact that some of these families found it important to leave a trace of their children's Catholic upbringing in Casalattico seems, again, interesting, and also a further indication of the strong ties that they maintain with their hometown, at least for a number of years. So as I mentioned and emphasized during the presentation, the connection between Casalattico and Northern Ireland and Ireland is very much ongoing on both sides of the migratory journey. And for many Casalatticesi, this journey, rather than being a move from A, Casalattico, to B, Northern Ireland, possibly with the final return to Casalattico for the lucky ones who are able to, who can afford to retire there. More than that, it's a perpetual coming and going. So I suppose that many of you are familiar with the wonderful novel Brooklyn by Colm Tobin. When I read it, reading it was a very emotional experience for me because I felt that it conveyed perfectly the kind of existential situation that most/all migrants probably experience, which is the awareness of having two possible lives before you, for the lucky ones who have that option. Two lives that are entirely separated from one another, or almost entirely separating, and realizing that you could potentially choose either, with all the losses and sadness that this could entail, but choose you must. There comes a point in most people's migratory journey, and it usually comes very earlier on, where you have to make a decision. Am I staying in the host country or am I going back? And the choice is usually dictated by very practical reasons. So who can afford having two homes, two rents or mortgages, the cost of traveling, the emotional cost of constantly leaving someone behind? Who can juggle two sets of lives and friends, two lives and two sets of friends? What do you do with healthcare? You get insurance here, you get it there, you get it in both places. And most importantly, obviously, what do you do with work? So even though we live in an era where remote work is a growing possibility for many, it certainly isn't the most obvious choice or the most common choice available to migrants. So you have a job, you basically have to decide, am I staying here or am I going back? And if I do go back, what am I going to do? So those of us who are, again, lucky enough to be able to return to our homeland at retirement age may do that. But again, this is not a common outcome, and also it's one that comes with its own challenges, of course. For most of us, like for the main character in Brooklyn, it's a matter of choosing between two alternatives. Now, this does not seem to apply to some of the people and individuals and families that I met in Casalattico. So the label migrants for them, even though it conveys a sense of fluidity, doesn't seem to be the best fit. Perpetual travelers probably works better. So these people seem to have managed to overcome that either-or existential condition that I was talking about. They appear to have achieved the impossible migrant dream of living and being both here and there, of not giving up on one of their lives and identities in favor of the other. For them, there does not seem to appear to be a final decision regarding what their real home is. Naturally, circumstances and the passing of time will probably make a decision for them, but existentially, they seem to be able and quite happy to keep their feet in two different stirrups, making the most out of both of their lives, their homes, and their selves. Their place of residence, which is always to an extent temporary, is dictated by the circumstances. They will go where they're needed, they return, they go back again, same as their parents did, and same as their kids will probably do. This is only possible because there are very strong family ties with several family members willing to contribute to the family business. And naturally, this mobility speaks volumes of their adaptability and entrepreneurship. So having their feet or keeping their feet in two stirrups at once seems to be a normal state for them and not a very problematic one. they seem to have struck that almost impossible balance that many migrants struggle with all their lives. Of course, there are second, third, fourth generation Italians from Casalattico who live in Northern Ireland in a stable manner. However, for many of them, the link with Casalattico is still there, both emotionally and practically. Some of them own homes in Casalattico, some visit friends and family when they can, or go when the festival is on. When it comes to these perpetual travelers' identities, things seem to be as fluid as their lives are. In fact, they seem to embody that fluidity or liquidity that we all talk about as a sign of modernity, but with which we often struggle in our actual daily lives. So would these people classify or identify as Italian, Irish-Italian, Italian-Irish? This is a question that each of them would probably answer differently, but their identity seems to be very much situational and processual. So depending on the circumstances, they will code switch among, among languages, English, Italian, the Casalatticese dialect, and possibly other languages that they speak. And they also code switch among cultures, experiences, and even personalities. This is something that every migrant does, and that everybody does in their daily lives to some extent. I don't talk this way when I'm with friends. The level of cursing would be a bit out of place here. However, for these perpetual travelers, the code switching, the coming and going, the impossible balance between two or more lives seem to be a central feature of their lives, more so than it is, I think, for most of us. So I'm not sure to conclude, I'm not sure how common or uncommon this pattern of perpetual mobility is. So I cannot say to what extent these observations may be replicated. However, I do feel that studying this perpetual mobility can shed light on how complex the migratory experience really is, and perhaps even on the multifaceted nature of identities to core. You never know, we may all be more fluid than we think, or maybe should be. Thank you. Thank you.
Very much, Lynn. It's
Thank
a
you.
fascinating subject, and I'm sure we'll have questions as people joining us online. Just raise your hand electronically, and Rebecca will let us know that you want to ask a question. Anyone in the room? Steve, you can start.
Sorry, Steve. Very quickly. I'm half Italian. My father is from Casalattico. He came here in 1980. So, but I visited it first 45 years ago.
Wow.
And there was a bar then.
Oh, there was.
And the thing about the bar was that Italy at the time was full of this sort of thing. It's a big communist flag over the bar.
Oh, was there? Oh,
so
interesting.
the village itself must have been communist. But
okay. When was that again? Sorry.
What?
When did you say that was?
I think probably about 45 years ago.
Okay.
But the other thing was, I think you've got an actual photograph of the place that used to be the bar.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly. Which is now somehow a pizzeria open during this.
Yeah.
Yes. But that's the place. Yes.
There's another thing. Just say this, and then you can ask some questions. But at the edge of the village, look up the hill. There's a village that used to be called Vrije. It's now called Monforte.
Yes.
And that village was the home place of the guy who set up this business, Empire Trust House 40. He started out as a waiter in Glasgow and managed to create this multi thing.
Yeah.
So when he retired, one of the things he did was he got a family tree done, a really detailed family tree. I don't know if you know that.
No, I don't know.
But what he also did was he got actual family trees made of everybody who married into the family. So we ended up, one of my ancestors, I think in the 19th century, 18th century, married into the family. So we got delivered to us a partial family tree. So I will like to see this.
Thank you. Yeah, we have an agreement there. Is this Forte, Paul Forte, no?
Forte. Yeah. Forte, which is...
No, but the person, sorry, is this Paul Forte?
He's called...
Yeah, Paul Forte, yeah.
Really at the village hub. building. So,
Yes.
he
Thank
moved.
you.
But anyway, so that was a Glasgow connection.
Yes, there's a big connection with Scotland as well. Yes, again, from a very small place.
Sorry, you got me talking. I went to a friend of my wife's. She's Scottish. A friend of my wife's was having his 60th birthday party, and we all went to. We rented this sort of semi-castle in Scotland. And I went, and there was a friend of his from Manchester there who was called Roseanne. Turns out to be a cousin of mine. And I never remember before.
Yeah.
So she had come up from Manchester.
Yeah.
Anyway, that's it. That's me.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks very much. That wasn't actually going to be my question, but just since you mentioned the Scottish connection, there's
Yeah.
another place in Italy where there's a disproportionate numbers of
Yeah.
people from called Barga, including one of my uncles, and they have that's a huge connection. They sell iron glue in Barga in Italy, like it's this very small village. It's close to London.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like I can imagine, but it's funny how these small.
Yes.
That's in Tuscany somewhere.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
But what I was interested in is this the Irish Fest, Irish Festival that you mentioned. So one of my PhD students, he's working on his PhD is all about how the Irish state leverages Irish traditional music and their relations with China. So the Irish state have got
The Irish, sorry.
the Irish state.
Okay.
So they have musicians that work in delegations.
Right.
Accompany ministers, and then they play for them and stuff. So what they're doing is they're using music as soft power, if you like, you know.
Right.
So it struck me that I wondered, is this similar in a sense that, you know, is the Irish state involved in any of this stuff? When you say Irish festivals that are going on here, is this sort of part of like a broader Italian strategy where they're trying to get involved, you know, with the Irish state using Irish soft power, or is it?
Not as far as I know. As far as I know, it seems to be like very much a local thing that is organized by people who are physically in Casalattico and or in Ireland, as I was saying. So I don't think so, but I will look it up. I'm not, from what I gather, there seems to be like a very sort of local initiative that is carried on because there are people who are constantly coming and going. So, but I'm not sure. There may be. Thank you.
Sophie.
Thank you very much. It's really interesting. I have two questions. One is kind of on that intermarriage question. Do you find that a lot of people, does this migration follow traditional Italian migration, which tends to be male heading, single men going out and then they might bring their families over, or do you find that it's more kind of couples going out together, especially historically? And also, do you find that the kind of the historical links with places like St. Malachy's and St. Joseph's and these places that are kind of bastions of Italian craftsmanship, do you find that there is a kind of strong community relationship with those places? I know there's certain parts of Milltown Cemetery which is very much the Italian kind of cemetery. So do you find that, as well as people going into the Crown and being like, oh yeah, Italians did that, that certain families kind of continue those strong links to the kind of built environment?
Thank you. So regarding the first question, was it couples or was it single men? I think the very beginning it was single men who then brought over family members and wives. This would be at the very beginning. Now, of course, in more recent years, it's probably a bit of both, you know. Regarding the built environment, are you referring to current Italian, like first generation Italians, or?
Kind of both. I suppose second and third generation. Well, I suppose third generation is the 1930s, 40s, 50s, and then it kind of, more second and third generation, granny and grandpa help build this and that.
Well, that's a very good question, and to be honest, I'm not sure. I haven't looked into that. So maybe you know.
So this is from my
Mm-hmm.
So at the end of his career, or his work career, there was a decline in in the terrazzo industry, partly because other materials come along which were more efficient. And the main, he did churches and things like that. The other thing they did on a big scale was operating theatre. Well, because with marble you just cleaned very an abattoirs. But once these other materials come in, that the clay, and that caused the clay, that sort of the clay all over that part of the industry. So that there probably isn't the same.
I think I'm thinking more of a kind of community memory of that you go back to certain churches or certain kind of operating theatres, because you're
Well,
because there is that community.
maybe not operating theatres, but one of the things that I remember was when I was a kid, he would dad would take me around, and he would do what you call homers, which is wee jobs for people on the floor of somebody's house or a patio for them or something like that. And I could still go around Belfast and see these, and that he did. And but he used to take me along to help him do it. And that was a Saturday for him, or a Saturday and Sunday. So it was always we kind of small scale thing as well,
I think, sorry, going back to what you were saying, I haven't looked into this in particular, but I think with third, fourth generations, etc., it seems to be a bit scattered. I wouldn't say there's necessarily a community of people, correct me if I'm wrong, of people from, of second, third, maybe second, but third, fourth generation who identify as a community. That seems to be quite far away. So, as I say, I haven't looked into that, but I tend to think because the whole thing is a bit scattered, possibly not, but.
Because it used to be next to the cliff
Yes.
and things, so that proximity, but elsewhere, I'm confused.
No, that's very interesting. I don't know. And people, of course, have moved everywhere and anywhere in Belfast, so they may be very far from that part of town at this point.
It's very family based. I mean, I'm very close to
Yeah.
all my extended family, more so than probably most people would think. It doesn't really much beyond that.
Yeah.
It's a sort of it's sort of a coincidence, just if I meet another somebody of the same faction.
Yeah. Yeah, I heard something similar from someone else who said, sometimes I'm walking down the road and I see someone and I think I know they're let's say Fusco for the sake of, so let's say that this person is from the Fusco family. She will say, well, when I see someone, I look at them, I'm like, I don't know them, but I know that they're from my family, and it turns out that they are. So as you were saying, probably more like a family thing than a community in that sense.
Yes. Perpetual travelers. This is a recent development. I've been traveling for it's past 40 years. 40 years ago, it's very difficult.
Yeah.
Now it's very easy. It's to Ryanair essentially.
Yes.
And probably Ryanair, but learning this travel more destination. They have very reasonable prices.
Mm-hmm.
So it would seem that, I mean, more than about 20 years ago, it would have been very difficult to leave this perpetual existence as a perpetual traveler. There's a recent development.
Yeah, well, I wouldn't be able to tell you what it was like 20 years ago because I haven't looked into that. But I'm sure that, it's much easier now. However, I mean, thinking about what the stories that people told me, I think it went on for longer than that. It may not have been like, I'm traveling every week, obviously, but more in the sense of, maybe creating a business here and then going back, but then the business is now run by the nephews. And so when there's a need for extra hands, the owners of the building, of the business would go back in that sense. So rather than, the kind of tourism or, get on a plane and I travel, I think it's more to do with this element of mobility when the existence of a business and a house there and a house here allows people to travel 30 years ago, yeah, it would have been difficult, more difficult for sure.
John?
You started your story with the people coming to work and try to serve. But I mean, Casalattico looks like a nice place, but I don't see very many opportunities for workers in decorative stone.
Yeah.
I mean, isn't it possible that like either been to Michael Street, skilled workers coming probably from other parts of the city, from the 1850s to the church building, and then people coming from Casalattico, mainly getting involved in the food industry when they come. A bit like what happens with the Jewish population. Where you have in the mid-19th century middle class immigrants like the Japanese who come attracted by the business opportunities. And then Jewish immigrants from Eastern Europe, which later would go around social scale. And I'm raising that because that would imply that there's a regional difference and a social class difference within the Italian population. Have we found that interesting as well?
Yeah. As I mentioned, I am a bit doubtful myself. So the historical information that I haven't dug out myself personally, but the historical information seems to suggest that originally it was skilled worker being brought here. What numbers are we talking about? I'm not sure. I haven't looked into that yet. But as you say, I myself find it difficult to imagine that there would be that many skilled workers in a place like Casalattico, which is, again, very small and very impoverished. So to answer your question, I'm not sure. Again, I'm not sure. But this is what the research seems to have indicated. But it may have been a very short-lived time because people did switch to other things quite quickly. And the family members that were brought in engaged in other activities, most likely because they were not skilled workers, they were not trained in any particular job. So they would become street musicians, street vendors. You were saying ice makers, ice cream makers, whatever was available. So I don't think we're talking big numbers of skilled workers. That would be strange. Yeah.
I wonder that if there are skilled workers coming from elsewhere in Italy, and then these poorer immigrants are coming in and being like, well, Italians have known their skilled work, and therefore we're going to take opportunities maybe to fake it till you make it as apprentices. I mean, I'm thinking of this.
That sounds plausible.
The Irish bomb maker in New York in the 1880s, but the Irish aren't like known for it. So the Russians are known as good bomb makers. So they start calling themselves like Professor Meserov and things because they were like, well, everyone might work out that they're not Russian as soon as they start speaking, but I can get enough students.
What were the things?
Bombs.
Bombs. B-O-M-B.
Yeah, Russians managed to blow bizarre.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah. No, that sounds very plausible.
It sounds like a very legitimate business.
It's a business. It certainly is a business. Yeah. Yeah. And also become trained here, as you were saying, because I've spoken with someone whose father was in the terrazzo flooring business, and he told me that this is much more recent, of course, but people were brought in and they were taught the job on the job kind of thing. So that seems plausible. And the same way that people make up this image that they could make ice cream without actually knowing how to make ice cream. Sure, why not?
I want to ask another question about marriage, because a lot of what you were saying, and particularly kind of return back and reverting to either using English or kind of the local dialect. But I mean, presumably migrants are moving to places like Northern Ireland and then marrying locals, or is there high prevalence of intermarriage within that community?
Some are and some aren't. So there are people of Italian origin whose surname is, I don't know, Morgan, because they married into local families. And there are people who...
My mother was called Morgan.
So there you see, maybe I met her. Sorry, I got lost there for a second. So yeah, I haven't done statistical research on that. But there seems to have been a lot of intermarriage because
Within the community.
yeah, within the community, especially originally again. So in the old days,
So it's
more
just-
so
it's
than-
one of the factors that weigh against what Archie Martin a long time ago talked about as the game of return. One of the factors that would weigh against that is that not just do you have work in the place that you migrated to, but
Yes.
you also have now
yes, yeah,
who may not want to go back.
yes,
And that
true.
would be a big anchor for people,
Yeah.
keeping people in one place.
yeah,
But
Sure.
I mean, that notion, the dream of return, it's praise of Archie Martin. I say, I think you taught University of Coleraine for a long time, so I think you know what he's talking about. But you know, that was just a dream. You could, until
Yes.
very recently,
yes,
that was just a dream.
Yes.
This seems to go against that pattern. But the other thing that goes against the standard patterns is that, you know, second and third generation migrant families, it's in those generations that people then begin to look into their roots, begin to examine what they think of as their authentic culture,
yeah,
as opposed to this one that's somehow being imposed on them.
Yeah. yeah.
And all of this seems to, it just seems to complicate migration in the ways that I've understood it for decades.
Well, it seems very complicated to me, to be honest. So the people that I was referring in the presentation as perpetual travelers would be people that you would classify as first generation. So people who are, you know, have lived in Northern Ireland or Ireland for a good number of years, are now coming back, going back when the need arises. Families in which maybe there's, you know, grandparents who migrated their returns, and now the grandchildren are doing the same thing. So I'm referring to people who are alive now, if you know what I mean,
Sure.
which is very much what my field would be, you know, talking to people who are actually alive, sort of. So yes, it would apply to people who are currently doing this. But as we mentioned, there are second, third, fourth generation, again, migrants between brackets, who are settled here and are not going back, and did marry from, you know, local people. So this would be more to do with people who are now in the process. But I find it interesting that within a family history, you seem to have a bit of all that. So if you take one family, I don't know, Fusco, for example, there would be part of the family who moved to Northern Ireland, stayed there, part of the family who stayed in Casalattico, and part of the family who maybe right now are, you know, coming and going. So yeah.
Okay, anything online? Any questions or comments?
Yes, one. Kira Nicholson says, thank you for a fascinating talk, and she particularly enjoyed your discussion around the use of different languages in Casalattico. I was curious whether you found any Irish language speakers or any interest in Irish.
No, I haven't. But then again, it's 5 days of field research, so it's very, very limited. Admittedly, very limited.
Element of the Irish.
I don't think so. No.
So the first thing is more a common question, which I'm always trying to use to do, but I wonder with the baptismal record, thinking off the top of my head here, how they might have begun, because to me, that's an unusual thing. I haven't come across that before, but I wonder, going back to the topic of marriage, if it's connected to for somebody to get married, you know, then in the Catholic Church, there's this idea that you go back to the parishes you previously been in, and you have to contact the priests there, and you know, they say, oh yeah, there's nobody on the record here, they married so and so here before, and so I wonder, is there a connection here between, or is it literature that people have written on those marriage records and the fact that that brings a connection back to these places, but also does that potentially start this book? You know, does somebody contact because they then got married and they're married and also pregnant at the same time, you know, or there is that, there's not there's maybe a short period between marriage and then the baptism or the child, and does that begin it, or does the priest himself, because obviously a lot of times where priests have been involved in the movement of people that, you know, like enforcing their movement for whatever reason. So, you know, is there, you know, the priest that was there, it's not maybe that's still. The other things were more about, I mean, you looked into the literature related to like hypermobility, hypermobile individuals. It's quite a lot in relation to kind of that literature that talks about this fact of people who are kind of have this ability to move quite frequently and how that impacts their, I suppose, movement, but also experiences in the different places. And then the other thing was, I think Kenny's recently edited a book. I can't remember the other person he's edited with, and that's unfortunate. Rituals to migration. It's written about Irish and Italian migration, but the process of the movement itself, as in their experiences whilst moving. So it's interesting when you were talking about the fact that they, these people are kind of moving and they're in the process of moving and they continue to move, and that different people in their family are either in one place or another, but the different generations are kind of across these different places. And I wondered if and
Sorry,
and I haven't read the book yet, but I wondered if in that it mentions things related to this kind of movement that's going on there. And then the other recommendation was Mark Scully's work. He's a sociologist in the Atlantic. And he looks at a lot of second and third generation identities, but I think also might be talking about rubbish here, but I definitely read somewhere, I think it's it, about this idea of kind of this pattern of moving back to the country that they were from. And people kind of, that's all related to kind of Irish diaspora, but I mean, yeah, that was kind of my thought.
yeah, no, thank you very much. No, even though this project has been ongoing for a while, the Casalattico branch is really small, very small part of the project. And also, even though it's been going on for quite a while, I'm quite behind because unfortunately, like many other migrants, money, work. So, but no, these are very good suggestions. So I haven't looked into them, but I will. Thank you. I was thinking, sorry, about intermarriage and that discussion. So within the registry, for example, there is effectively a lot of intermarriage. So I would have the families Cafolla, Liegio, Fusco, Notar Antonio, and you will have a such and such Mary, I don't know, Maria Cafolla marrying a Liegio, having a child. So there was, I think, initially a lot of intermarriage.
You think that? So I know that, like, this might be hearsay, but in Shetland, for example, the librarian keeps a note of who is like having children with who, because they're really cute. They're small communities, so you have to make sure that it's not too close. In Iceland,
all right, okay, yeah.
In Iceland, they've got entire like health systems.
All right.
Where you attract to make sure you're not sleeping with common person.
Yeah.
The community.
That's fair.
So if people are leaving, but intermarriage is still continuing, I wonder if this registry is, if you didn't have like
at the time.
Yeah, maybe, but
I don't know.
because if you're in the community, a family member might be able to be like, but if you're abroad, you can keep an eye on those things. But I do think that probably something like Colin does, where you can't trust the parish records in the diaspora, especially if you're moving around. So you need that kind of central thing.
Yeah, I think depending on the historical time that we're talking about, certainly in the 1880s, it seems like a very remote worry at the time. So yeah, I feel it's, but again, I don't know how this registry originates. I think it's more to do with making sure that everybody knows that the child is baptized. Back in the day, it seems like a, I don't know, it seems like a very kind of modern concern. But again, sorry, say that again.
It's not that common. It's not that modern a concern.
No, but I mean that people did get married and they notified that after the event. So whatever the case.
I think it is much more likely that my work room would have had wives there initial home parish for a letter from the priest that they were, they could be married.
Right.
So they hadn't been
Yeah.
married already, or something, or even against it.
Right.
Still sort of applies.
That's possible. Yeah. Yeah.
Certain churches.
Yeah. Maybe. Yeah.
Connor, another one?
Very quickly, I also wondered, is there evidence that all of those records in that book are all connected to people contacting back, or are they also harvesting information from local newspapers and like that as well?
It seems to be people sending the information back home. Yeah. There's no mention of any. So there's mention of who was present at the baptism, the mother, the father, where it was baptized. It seems like people were sending out the information.
Right, there's nothing else? No? Okay, well, I might ask one last question then, Elena. So obviously for long periods of the kind of post-war years, within Western Europe, states were favourable towards significant labour migration. That was obviously enhanced by the development of the European Union, and Italy and the UK, both big parts. That has obviously changed significantly since 2016, and we're now into a legal regulatory environment in which a hostile environment is more typical than encouragement of free labour migration. So thinking about the people that you have spoken to and interviewed both here and at Casalattico, is there an anxiety about changing regulatory environment around migration? Is there a perception that Brexit is potentially to kill off this type of free movement between the two?
The honest answer is I don't know because I haven't asked. So unfortunately, I'm not sure. That's the truth of the matter. Yeah. I mean, the people that I've spoken with don't seem to be concerned with that. But then again, I suppose it would have to be a direct question and then a direct conversation, which we haven't had. So, yeah.
It might be a question worth asking.
Yeah.
I think,
Yeah.
So people now in the second or third generation, they're sensitive to long time, or maybe 1 year national whatever issue. But I mean, there have been a number of stories in papers that I viewed. People assumed that they were in good standing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We discovered that gold holiday.
Yeah. Yes. Again, my feeling from talking to people and from being an Italian myself is that this movement is not always legal, if you want to use legal terminology. So, there's a family.
And if the state turns a blind eye, there's no problem to that. But if as we've heard recently,
yes,
people residents in Northern Ireland losing their child benefit because of new regulations around where you fly from and who's counting how many months you're away residency. And these are all kind of disincentives to mobility.
Yeah, I assume we still have to tell potential summer school students not to fly into
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, but I mean, I had some difficulties at the flying into the UK because for a whole thing about my settlement status. But anyway, but there are ways around that. You fly through Dublin, and then nobody asks anything, and then you get on a bus. And in terms of legal or not legal employment, I mean, is anybody ever going to check? Who works?
Isn't this what Keir Starmer's giving us digital ID?
Well, but I don't know. I mean, there are ways around things, is what I'm saying.
Well, long may that continue.
Well, yes. Well, no, but that's an interesting question. Yeah.
Anyway, thank you very much, Elena. It's a really fascinating subject. Thank you for enlightening us about it. Can we thank Elena?
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for the question.
Okay, so next week we have Aaron Morgan coming up from Cork to talk about forced famine in the